Saving the Queen by William F Buckley Jr. All of the characters in this book are fictitious, and any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is therefore coincidental.
Dedicated to F. Reed Buckley, ex culpa me, quod minxi informam, quam magnifice perficisti. Acknowledgments. I don't yet know whether I, let alone the world of letters, am indebted to Mr. Samuel Vaughan of Doubleday for his mischievous suggestion that I write a novel in the first place, but I am certainly indebted to him and to his associates Betty Prashke and Hugh O'Neill for their acute criticisms and fine suggestions. My thanks also to my friend and aide Frances Bronson for her help with the manuscript, to Robin Wu for his research, and to someone who prefers to remain anonymous for critical help in the research. And finally, my thanks yet again to Joseph Isola for reading The Galleys with his incomparable eye. Saving the Queen, Prologue. His three friends, his closest professional friends, were there at dinner in part because they weren't the type of people you have to tell it is time to leave. They could have stayed on to discuss the business at hand indefinitely, but really it would have been repetitious. Sometimes it doesn't matter if you say the same thing again and again in 3 or 4 different ways. It is a subtle technique for advancing a position, dangling it high so that you can look at it from different angles, letting all the facets shine. But there were objections to doing so tonight. For one thing, he was right up against the deadline and had to save those final hours to make his own decision. For another, the alternatives had not been raised at the dinner table for the first time. They had been the center of conversation among the highest officials of the Central Intelligence Agency ever since it had been resolved that a special panel, headed by the Vice President, would interrogate them deeply about the kind of thing the CIA had been doing. For a while it was expected within the organization that a party line would be laid down by the director, but as the days went on, it became clear that he was not intending to do anything of the sort. Perhaps in other days, but Watergate had just come and was not by any means yet gone. There a party line had been laid down, and it was only a matter of months before the people on the other side seized on the contradictions, charted them, computerized them, gloated over them, and then almost every day in the right-hand column of the morning paper someone else was indicted. At the opposite end of the paper, the headline reported the conviction of the poor wretch indicted 6 months earlier for following the party line. Besides, no one in the agency was going to urge him, A, to take an oath, and then B, to tell a lie. If he wanted to, he could always plead the Fifth Amendment. I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President, but I must decline to answer your question on the grounds that by doing so I might incriminate myself. That, Anthony Trust had remarked round the little dinner table in the handsomely appointed dining room, is a pretty elegant solution, you know. They can have you fired, but would they? And what if the rest of us did it, right down the line? We'd be roasted by the press. But there's something of a corporate nobility in our all doing it. Anthony, his host, smiled. You have a wonderful way of glamorizing things, which is one reason, I suppose, why you are a successful veteran in this accursed profession, into which you corrupted me as an innocent 24-year-old. Trust spoke with a straight face. Could we please cut the crap? He smiled at his oldest friend, still a bachelor, and at 46 quickly becoming the most eligible one in town, tall, slim, with the dark glamour and bright, sudden smile, and the mysterious affinity for his work to which, indeed, he was married, as they say routinely of priests who are married to Mother Church. It wasn't known whether Anthony would be summoned before the panel. The agency, the top people had long since ceased calling it the company, that was for recruits, middle echelon bureaucrats, and popular novelists, had distributed a directive announcing that it was the wish of the Rockefeller panel that witnesses should not consult with one another either to coordinate strategy or to compare notes. It could not seriously be expected that such an order would be observed. No force on earth, that spring evening in 1975, at 3025 Peace Street Northwest, could have kept him and Anthony Trust and King Harmon and Singer Calloway from discussing the subject that quite naturally preoccupied them, so much so that he had sent his wife and youngest son to spend the week at the cottage at Martha's Vineyard. He had been told he should make no other appointments during the entire week, suggesting the possibility that he would be on the stand during the whole period, allowing for the lengthy recesses a panel of such eminence permitted itself for the discharge of other duties. Still, the staff was always on duty. It had been different with the director. He had testified the preceding week, rather briefly. Presumably the panel intended to recall him after listening to his subordinates. His associates assumed they would hear the gist of his testimony. Even if he failed to come into them obliquely through an intermediary, at least they could reasonably expect to read about it in the New York Times, to which surely one of the Rockefeller panel would leak it. But they had been nothing at all, and now suddenly it was his turn, and he had no knowledge of what his responsibilities were. When the original announcement of an investigating panel was made, he had gone straight to the director. "What's the line, chum?" He tended to become increasingly idiomatic as tension increased. This had become something of a trademark, though he remained really without affectation, with the possible exception that he never labored to conceal his intelligence, which is so much the accepted thing to do that, acting naturally, intelligence sometimes becomes suspect as affectation. The director was not so much hostile as protective. "Look," he began, "there's a hanging party out there. Never mind who it is, let's stay professional, as we are trained to do, and keep our emotions out of it. They want the Rockefeller panel to report that we have been—" He began to slur. "Lying, stealing, killing, bribing, forging, fornicating as a matter of official foreign policy for 25 years. They're not interested in what makes up 99% of our time, which is studying the rainfall in the Ukraine. We're about to be examined by a political body. When a political body is convened, it has to satisfy political appetites. How to do that and do minimum damage to the country is something I can't write a directive about. For one thing, I'm expressly forbidden to do so. For another, each of us has slightly different responsibilities and, predictably, a different way of explaining them to anybody who asks us to explain them." And finally, he walked away from his desk. "I'm not going to suggest to anybody, let alone order him, to say something that will cause him to end up spending 5 years in jail as a reward for risking his life for his country." He paused. Distracted a moment ago, he now looked wizened and cynical. "There's no feeling any more for the kind of thing we're doing, and there's no way overnight to stimulate that kind of feeling. I sometimes feel if the Washington Post's next edition revealed that at midnight I called the president and tipped him off that the entire first strike resources of the Soviet Union were programmed to launch against us at 6 a.m., and the president persuaded Brezhnev against it after 3 hot hours on the hotline, the investigative reporter would give it out that the agency had nearly triggered a nuclear war. Go away. By God, I'll be interested in how you handle them. I'll have the advantage of reading your transcript. Probably you'll never see mine. I don't know whether things will ever be the same after the hearings. Maybe we can use our remaining contact in Turkey and get jobs as eunuchs in the baths the congressmen patronize on counterpart funds. Say, I wonder where I got that information. Take a note. Find out the name of the agent who gave me that information and fire him. No, better still." The director was now playing Ronald Colman and flicked his fingers as if discarding an ash from a cigarette holder. Better still, get rid of him." But he permitted himself a smile as he shot out his trigger finger to the door, which was the director's distinctive way of saying "out," to which there was no known demurral. After saying good night, his guests walked down the street towards Anthony's car. Singer said, "You know, I don't have any idea what Black is going to do. I mean, I just can't guess what he's going to do. If they set aside a whole week for him, they've obviously decided to go over his entire period of service to find out what one man, beginning at the bottom and going up just about all the way, actually did." Anthony Truss said, "They've picked on a man who got off to one hell of a start." There was no comment. Harmon, for one, knew nothing about the first assignment. Anthony knew more than he let on, but he didn't know it all, by any means, and it would greatly have surprised Singer Calloway to discover that not even he, who had been intimately involved in the operation, knew exactly how far the young man had got in the course of saving the Queen. Chapter 1. Blackfoot Oaks was a good listener, but he had also developed skills at guiding any conversation in the direction he wanted to take it, including termination. Still, despite almost 4 years of practice with John Liebman, the skill tonight was offset by his roommate's lamentable condition. Though it was only 10:30, Johnny was quite drunk and quite determined to tell Blackie in very considerable detail why, after all, he had decided not to marry Joan, the sufficient explanation of which Blackfoot knew but was careful not to reveal, namely Joan's antecedent decision not to marry John. Then Johnny, opening the window to reach for another can of beer, sitting on the sill overlooking Davenport College courtyard, discovered with horror that there were none left, and reaching into the cigarette box to dampen his frustration, discovered that he had simultaneously run out of cigarettes. He turned to Blackfoot. "You and your goddamn continence. I guess after graduation you'll go into training for the graduate engineering school lacrosse team and inflict on the next guy the necessity to go out into the wild night in search of a normal room with normal people and normal supplies of the normal vices of this world." Johnny got orotund when he was tight, and Blackfoot smiled at the familiar chiding, but mostly at the prospect of Johnny's going out. It was safe to assume in his present condition that he'd be gone at least a couple of hours, and that would give Blackfoot the time to open and study the sealed envelope passed to him that afternoon by the assistant registrar, after receiving in the morning mail the unheard-of summons, "Please report Wednesday, March 14 at 4 p.m. At Yale, mere registrars don't summon students thus peremptorily. Out of sheer curiosity, Blackfoot had complied with the summons, rather than ignore it and wait for a conciliatory telephone call. Freshly returned from the war 4 years earlier, before Yale's bureaucracy became adjusted to dealing with war veterans, he once had been summoned by the engineering dean himself for missing a morning class. Engineering students were allowed no cuts. He appeared before the huge, apple-cheeked, egg-balled bachelor who was rumored not to have left the Yale campus in 40 years except to take the baths in Germany during the summer. "Mr. Oaks, why did you miss your chemistry class last Tuesday?" "Diarrhea, sir," Oaks replied with great gravity. Even as he said it, he winced at the memory of Grayburn College, where he had tested the limits of insolence as a 15-year-old and lost very heavily. But he was 21 now, a freshman, a war veteran, something in fact of a minor ace, and in an instant he knew he would win this one. The dean paused just long enough to divulge helplessly his despair at framing an appropriate reply. He mumbled something about the necessity for maintaining rigid attendance records in the engineering school, and Oaks left and cut as many classes thereafter as he was in the mood to do, without ever laying eyes again on the dean, except when the vast old man led the academic parades, carrying the huge mace, and looking neither to the right nor to the left, nor ever, under any circumstances, in the direction of Blackfoot Oaks, 1951. Now at the registrar's he was put through to the assistant who had summoned him. Blackfoot was given a large envelope, with instructions to open it there and then. Inside was a typewritten note attached by paperclip to a second bulky envelope. The note said, "The person who has handed you this package is cleared. The attached envelope is to be opened when there is no possibility of your being seen or interrupted. Take the note you are now reading, detach it from the envelope, and return it to the person who gave you the package. Further instructions will be given to you in due course." Blackfoot looked up at the registrar's assistant, a freckled man in his 30s, probably a failed graduate student who had eased into the educational bureaucracy and had acquired one of those special clearances Anthony had told him about. There was nothing more to say, so he returned the note folded, thinking to himself that he was off to a good start by folding it so as to conceal the printed matter. "Thanks," he said, and walked out past the secretary and the 4 bookkeepers. He wondered vaguely which of them had written on his March bill, "Mr. Oakes, your account is 3 months past due." His stepfather paid all Blackfoot's bills promptly, once they were 90 days overdue. Sometimes when he wanted a bill paid on time, his stepfather gave him $50 a month and paid all his bills unflinchingly. He would type or write in disguised hand over the face of the bill, "Please remit, 90 days overdue." He mentioned this to Anthony Trust at one of their frequent meetings in New York, and was faintly surprised to hear Anthony, so urbane in all matters, say, "Avoid petty deceptions," to which Blackfoot had answered, "Avoid saying avoid anything," and Anthony flashed that total smile, so specially appealing for its rarity. When I ran out of money at Yale, Trust had graduated a year earlier, I bought a stamp, "Deceased, return to sender." It obviously didn't work at places like Maury's, where they would see me night after night. For them it was just a post office error, but it did work with a lot of odd lot accounts. Yet you see, Black, that was a major deception, and that's all right. And besides, he said, when I get money, this euphemism was standard for when my mother dies, I'll pay everyone back through a lawyer who will announce that young Trust, who died while a student at Yale, is the posthumous beneficiary of a legacy, part of which has been reserved for paying bills outstanding at the time of his death. Anthony Trust was Blackfoot's oldest friend. Blackfoot recognized that chronological seniority is an unreliable fix on friendship. He was surrounded by classmates who were fonder of classmates they had not known longer than a few months or years than they were of their own brothers or sisters, or of friends they had come upon as classmates at kindergarten or grammar school or high school. There is no correspondence between length of service as friend and intensity of friendship, but there with Anthony the friendship had been of long standing and of intensity. They had met as schoolboys during a period in England that had a gruesome climax. But that climax, although no doubt it annealed their friendship, did not bring it about. Black found himself situated to recognize in Anthony a quality he did not describe, but once or twice in freewheeling conversations with Sally, he ventured to say that, when all was said and done, there were those students at Yale who cared primarily about themselves, even if you interpreted this widely enough to include girls, grades, dogs, wives, children, natural and unnatural, and dependent grandmothers, the whole lot. And others who somehow felt as automatically as anyone starting a long motor trip would feel the necessity to check the fuel gauge, the necessity to meditate regularly on the human condition. Anthony did this in a most natural way, rather like St. Teresa, with her worldly, workaday concern for the comfort of the sick sow and the dangers to the immortal soul of the King of Spain. Black, how dare you come out in favor of the Munt-Nixon bill without asking yourself what its likely consequences are for lambs in the State Department who have strayed? Anthony, for one thing, though formal of speech, was incapable of pomposity. Besides, he cared more about effective relief for those who suffered than about bombastic relief for those who formed committees. Often the main purpose of humanitarian groups was to relieve themselves of effective concern for those who suffered. Anthony shrank from any form of reductionism. If you made the mistake after the 6th beer at Maury's of asking him to identify the principal source of evil in the modern world, he would pretend he didn't understand you. He disliked theoretical formulations, but increasingly those who knew him came to know what it was that principally horrified him. He said to Black late one night at a beer joint on Park Street, "After Hitler and Stalin, you had to say to yourself, things have got to get better." Trust influenced Blackfoot more than that, had something of a hold on him from the time they were at school together in England just before the war, and Trust was in the 5th form and Blackfoot a callow 3rd former. And now Trust had talked him into chucking plans for graduate school and instead applying for an altogether different line of work. Blackfoot's reasoning at first had been straightforwardly self-serving. The Korean War was beginning to go badly. He had received a note instructing him not to leave the country. His reserve unit was on standby notice. Unless he entered the FBI or a paramilitary research institute or developed a sudden gratifying disability, he might very well go from graduation to a quick refresher course in the latest fighter planes with which he was dangerously current, having spent a month last summer mastering the new jet, and from there to Korea. Korea, Truss said. You thought France was a dull place to return to after a mission. Blackfoot had arrived in France in December 1944, fought several rather spectacular missions. He contacted and destroyed 3 Kraut Me-109s, out of RAS, contracted and did not detect hepatitis in January, and celebrated VE Day at the hospital in Maxwell Field. I have been to Korea, said Anthony. Unlike MacArthur, I shall not return. Blackfoot knew that, of course. Anthony would return, if told to do so. Either that or he would quit. But he would not be likely to quit at such a time an organization he was selling to Blackfoot, even if he stressed in the early conversations only the advantages of the CIA over the United States Air Force in Korea. Blackfoot sensed the other factor on the following Saturday. They had been ushers at a wedding and were driving together to New York with that bleary after-party feeling that makes ritual conversation unbearably irrelevant, inducing great bouts of deep talk. Soon he realized that Anthony felt himself a member of a brotherhood. His distinctive individualism had been already conspicuous at 17 at Greyburn College. Though a prefect, Anthony was never a member of the prefecture. In the Naval Air Force, he would contrive to go to a movie whenever there was a squadron social function or a threat of one. At Yale, he was asked to join and declined a fraternity, an honor society, a secret society, and a literary society. His only apparent extracurricular involvements were an occasional letter to the Yale Daily News, acerbic, polished, and conclusive in the sense of unfailingly suggesting that any contrary opinion should not presume to expect from him any rebuttal, and membership in the political union and debating team, whose meetings he generally missed. But in those letters there was a strain of idealism. He did not believe in cheating, which wasn't that unusual, but it was awfully unusual to say so in public, and rarer still to combine moralism with a debonair style. He thought the coup in Czechoslovakia the most devastating development in European history since Hitler's march on the Sudetenland, and he was savage in his destruction of the local fellow traveler in the history department who had dismissed it at a college forum as a natural preemptive Soviet maneuver against fascist resurgence. The candidacy of Henry Wallace aroused his supreme scorn, and he actually tabulated the communist fronts to which Wallace's most conspicuous backers had belonged, and on one occasion even defended, at a formal debate, the proposition, resolved, fellow travelers are worse than the real thing and should go to jail until they are old and gray. Sarah Lawrence won, defending the negative, and everyone cheered, and Anthony remained unimpressed. Although he was studying as an exchange student at Oxford when the Wallace movement realized its fiasco in November, he was amused by the virtually unanimous pleasure that defeat had given to campus spokesman for liberalism. Blackfoot had sent him a copy of the Yale Daily News. They caught up with me, he told Black. Blackfoot now tore open the envelope. He fingered then the longest form he had ever seen, 40 pages. Leafing through it, he realized it would take him a full day's work to complete. The questions were of a dogged thoroughness that made the comprehensive form for flight school in 1943 look like a driver's license application. Blackfoot was methodical and neatly put away in a file case beside his typewriter all the necessary autobiographical documents reposed: birth certificate, draft card, discharge papers, curriculum and grades dating back to early childhood. He had neatly recorded the date of his mother's birth in Buffalo and of his father's in Akron, and even the basic figures on his stepfather. He could see that he would have to explain in some detail the reason he spent the night in jail in Cambridge, but he thought the circumstances innocent enough. Or was the CIA made up only of people who never attended a bachelor party? He had never belonged to any political organization of any sort, though he would certainly have joined America First if they had accepted 14-year-olds. And other than the Air Force Reserve, there was only the fraternity at Yale and the Senior Society, in response to any mention of which, he smiled, he would dutifully leave the room as tradition prescribed. He knew how many countries he had visited, how long he had spent there. Even if some of these countries he could not remember, he had been too young. Anyway, his father's junketing about the world to exhibit and sell airplanes, it was natural until the divorce. that Black should have jogged about with the family. He knew exactly whose names to give as references, though he would not give the name of Dr. Chase at Greyburn or of Mr. Simon, but yes, he would give the name of Mr. Long, the athletic director, with whom in the last 10 years he had exchanged diffidently worded Christmas cards. Filling out the form would be an ordeal, but Blackford had an engineer's aptitude for recognizing the necessity of painstaking detail. All progress, someone had written, is made by the taking of careful measurements. He realized about himself that he could become an accountant without any great strain on his spirit, provided, of course, there was plenty of after-hours activity. Within 3 days he managed to complete the form by carefully synchronizing his work on it with Johnny's frequent absences from their little suite, and then he stuffed it into the envelope plain, addressed to someone he had never heard of in Chevy Chase, Maryland. 2 months later, he became anxious and called Anthony, who said that there was no way he could help him, that it was altogether possible that he would never officially know whether Black had been accepted, that there was literally nothing to be done, inasmuch as the CIA people already knew from the covering letter that if he didn't act before the United States Air Force did, they would either lose Blackford to the Air Force or face the intricate job of extricating him from his unit without, so to speak, anybody noticing. This the CIA knew how to do, but since it was always something of an operation, it was preferable to act quickly, preemptively. "If they turn me down, how will they do it?" he asked Anthony. "You'll never hear from anybody again." So Blackford completed his application for graduate school rather listlessly, convinced, correctly, that he would never matriculate during this bellicose season. They were eating up fighter pilots in Korea. He felt rather bad about asking the 2 professors to write long, enthusiastic letters of recommendation, but after all, he was an honest student with very high scores on the aptitude tests. Perhaps when it was all over, he would go back to engineering. He found it especially vexing that he couldn't talk to anyone except Anthony about the application. The terms were laid out matter-of-factly. Any leak would disqualify him. Conversations with Sally about his future became wooden, and once, late on a Friday afternoon, before he took the 7 o'clock train to New York, with Johnny safely departed for Poughkeepsie, she said to him, slouching on the sofa, listening to the new phonograph that played 33 RPM, that he was beginning to sound like an erector set, on which remark Blackford made a ribald pun, naturally, and Sally, who was nicely spontaneous, eased up her skirt a bare but unmistakable inch, which was her signal for encouraging his ardor. Even then, blissfully distracted, he found himself wondering in medias res, would his future duties require him to seduce women routinely? He had been reading intensively in the general literature of intelligence, and remarked that the old melodramatic idea of the spy whose achievements were done mostly through sexual manipulations and carrier pigeons had gone through a generation's literary disparagement. The subject came up these days only for the purpose of poking fun at it. Spy work consists in 8 hours a day with a dictionary and a basket full of foreign language newspapers and magazines available at any cosmopolitan newsstand, one ex-OSS graduate student had told him. But his blood had quickened when Anthony said one day that this was only largely true, that the other stuff was also true, and that a month didn't go by that someone, one of ours, one of theirs, as he put it, didn't get eliminated. "Or seduced?" Blackford asked. Anthony looked disgusted and changed the subject. Blackford had whispered to Sally audaciously that she was such an accomplished seductress. "You ought to become a foreign spy, Sally." Sally replied unnervingly, "How did he know she wasn't one?" "I admit," she said later, her eyes sparkling, an unlit cigarette in her mouth, "my accent is so American you wouldn't be expected to guess what my real country is." He took a cigarette, lit it clumsily, and said in the accents of Humphrey Bogart, "All right, baby, the game's up. Don't try anything because the police are outside." Then he inhaled deeply, but spoiled the intended effect by coughing convulsively for 10 minutes. It was the first ingestion of tobacco smoke since the vow he took along with the freshman swimmers 4 years ago, "Hope to die he said, looking the coach in the eye. "No cigarettes as long as I swim." Later, he sat down in the dining car, and, textbook in front of him, gave his order: frankfurters and beans. He couldn't charge this dinner to his stepfather. A flannel-suited type sat down opposite him, and Blackford raised his eyes briefly, hoping it wasn't a college friend who would interrupt the hour-and-a-half New Haven, New York run he coveted for his book. It was nobody he knew, and in any case the bulky man was obviously as anxious to read his Journal American as Blackford was to read his book. Neither engaged in any way a third man who was slowly eating his cheese, washing it down with red wine, and complaining to the waiter that it had been chilled. After the main course was removed, dessert rejected, the dinner paid for, and the disgruntled cheese-taster finally gone, lecturing the porter on the way out, the flannel man leaned over and passed the sugar, which Blackford had not requested. He said in a quiet monotone, "Mr. Oakes, your application has been acted on. We are familiar with your schedule, and you should not have any problem in coming in to see us tomorrow morning at 10:06. Press the button with the name Lawrence Dickering at 23 West 24th Street. You will need to put aside about 2 hours. You are to advise no one that you have been approached." He folded his paper, stood up, and said good night. Blackford took the subway and headed straight to Anthony's apartment. "That's a bit goddamn much. How long have you creeps been following me around? I wasn't sure what train I'd take this afternoon. No wonder they're recruiting all over America. They must need millions of people. Now I know what my job's going to be, to ride the rails until I see through my special prismatic lenses the invisible ink on somebody's lapel, and sit down and tell him to go to 23 West 24th Street and ring old Larry Dickey's number so that we can get one more guy to ride another railroad and keep Dickey Dickering." Black paused. "How did you know?" "Forget it," said Anthony. "Remember, other people's rituals always seem strange. We'll talk about it later, a lot later, and you can tell me then what happens and how you would run things if you were head of CIA." He rose and left, saying good night mechanically. Though the door to the hallway stayed open and the elevator took a full minute to come, he said nothing else, nor did Anthony. Blackford walked to the party, a dozen blocks away, down Park Avenue in waning June light, the spring song of the trapped little island soothing his spirits. He passed the Soviet legation on 67th Street and stopped. As he looked through the iron rails into the courtyard, he thought of the time 3 years before, when a Soviet schoolteacher had landed there after leaping. He looked up at the great vertical distance between the stories of the old mansion to the third floor where she had been detained. The police and ambulance arrived, and she protested her imminent deportation to Russia, where she said she was destined for liquidation because she had inadvertently revealed her disillusionment with communism to a boyfriend who turned out to be an MGB agent. Moments after arriving at the hospital, Soviet muscle men materialized guarding her room. The Soviet ambassador announced flatly to the press that Madame Kosenkina would fly to Moscow immediately on being released from the hospital, that she was a Soviet civil servant whose behavior was none of America's business. An ingenious New York attorney woke up a judge and got a court order giving her a habeas corpus authority over her own movements, and she limped out of the hospital under the glare of her immobilized captors to an undisclosed haven causing, it was somewhere reported, a splendid storm of outrage late at night when the news was timidly given to Stalin himself. Blackford wondered if the CIA had been involved in any way. Then a policeman approached him. "You'll have to move on, no loitering here." Blackford did as he was told, but the habit was ingrained in him, only after that slight hesitation that causes doubt and not a little apprehension. The policeman was relieved when the young man suddenly strode off, because his build, though slim, was pronouncedly athletic, and deep in his eyes there was an anarchic stubbornness which policemen detailed to guarding the Soviet legation were experienced enough to spot and, as necessary, make provision for. Chapter 2. He had intended to ask Anthony whether 10:06 was an affectation, but forgot, and accordingly took pains to be punctual. This required him, it being Saturday and the subways uncrowded, to walk at an exaggeratedly slow speed, having arrived at the 23rd Street and 6th Avenue subway station at 9:48. The last thing he did before bunking down at Aunt Alice's apartment was dial ME71212 and set his watch exactly. There was a newsstand on the corner, and he lingered there, wondering whether in the CIA they teach you the art of lingering unself-consciously. He remembered the story his father had told him when he was a little boy about the old man with the beard who was asked one day, did he go to sleep with the beard under the covers or outside them? And the man said, I don't remember. And that night he tried it first with his beard under, then over the covers, couldn't sleep, and in due course died of fatigue. How Blackfoot had mused on that. It occurred to him now that all his life he had loitered at bookshops and newsstands without the least self-consciousness, but now he was absolutely convinced he was being watched, and accordingly he couldn't finger a newspaper or a pocketbook or a magazine casually, though he amused himself by thinking that maybe if old Dickering was watching him through his window with binoculars, Blackfoot should ostentatiously pick up a newspaper and read it upside down. Why did his heart begin to beat and his mouth dry up? I am 25 years old, a week away from a magna cum laude degree at Yale University. I shot down planes in combat in a world war. I have faced down deans and generals and brothel keepers, and I am suddenly nervous at meeting a GS-14 in a New York apartment. He put down the newspaper, buttoned the bottom of his seersucker jacket, and strode purposefully to the door he had already, by a process of sidewise visual elimination, calculated as necessarily being number 23. There were 8 buttons to choose from in the dingy exterior. Dickering's was first floor, rear. He pushed the bell, and as he did so, looked at his watch and cursed himself. Only 10:05. The buzzer sounded, and he pushed open the door and walked through the dark corridor with the old linoleum on the floor toward a green door. Well below Blackfoot's eye level was a card, Lawrence Dickering. He looked for a bell, but there wasn't any, so he knocked, and Anthony Trust opened the door. Blackfoot was at once relieved, intrigued, and enraged. He said nothing as he walked into the room with 2 armchairs and a sofa, a desk of sorts, and a fireplace that probably hadn't been used in years. The walls were papered, and 2 or 3 prints of old New York hung haphazardly here and there. There was a coffee table with a morning's New York Times and Wall Street Journal, and a large bookcase with books, but no book jackets, as though they had been accumulated over a number of years, none of them recent. The door leading presumably to a bedroom was closed. On the floor the carpet was brown and old. Blackfoot sat down on one of the armchairs. Trust stayed standing and began to pace up and down the room. A minute or 2 passed. "This wasn't my idea," Trust said, and after another pause, "but I suppose it's not such a bad idea. I just wanted you to know I didn't volunteer." Blackfoot remained silent. "Blackie, this is going to take time, and only part of it is my fault. Look, in the company, the CIA, there are lots of categories and distinctions. One of them is between the deep cover agent and the agent who is, well, something else. The decision was made in your case, don't ask me why, to accept your application and to train you as a deep cover agent. Now this means a lot of funny things happen to you, like the business last night on the goddamn train. He knows who you are for the simple reason that he was the principal leg man checking out your background. He knows everything about you. Well, he doesn't know the Grayburn bit, but he even poked around Cambridge and checked out the drunk charge at Bailey's wedding. Now, Trust had obviously done this before, and Blackfoot wondered how many times. Get a load of this. He knows you're headed into the company. I obviously know it. But apart from the 2 of us, there is exactly one other human being who knows it. A committee of men know you exist in the sense that they know the qualifications of a certain applicant. But before they went over those qualifications, all identifying figures were removed or disguised. They decided to take on as a covert agent a young guy freshly out of college, competent in French, highly skilled in engineering and theoretical physics, with a mother living in London, with her well-connected and prosperous husband, a British businessman. Subject's father is a sort of commercial gypsy flyboy genius in the airplane brokerage racket. Subject is well regarded by faculty and students, is healthy and smart, physically attractive, indeed is known to have been irresistible to several ladies, was an officer and an ace during the war, is said to be well-adjusted, tenacious and cool-headed, and, forgive me this, Black, fond of his country and of its liberal institutions. They know you as Jeffrey T. Truax. By the way, Black, you may as well commit that to memory, since that is now your name. You'll be assigned under that name to some mission, nature undisclosed, and for all I know, unformulated. This much I have been told. You will be sent to England. Deep cover agents need above all things a convincing cover. A mother who lives in London is considered good natural cover. You haven't really visited with your mother much since the war. It's natural you should join her, and since your stepfather is both wealthy and an architect, it makes sense that he should vaguely welcome you to England for a year or so, maybe to see whether a young Yale-trained engineer could make out in London, details to be worked out. First, at this end you'll receive in the next day or two an order to report for an Army physical. When you check in, you'll be put through the usual routine. Your chest X-ray, when developed, will show a tiny spot on the lung. You'll be reassured that with modest precautions it won't keep you from living a full and vigorous life, but you will be instantly discharged from the reserves. This heartbreaking news you'll make known to your friends. Anthony now mocked his friend's formal verbal formulations, with an appropriate blend of joy and sorrow, a formula the Central Intelligence Agency is pleased to leave to your own devising. You will then approach the dean and tell him your doctor has recommended a year of relative leisure, and that you are therefore withdrawing your application for graduate school and going to England and the continent for the next year. Say that you will advise the dean's office next spring what the doctor says about the prospects of your re-entering school. Now, here is a ticklish one. You must spend 2 months during the summer in Washington. There you'll get whatever training the deep cover people get, which is scant in contrast to what the in-house professionals get.
This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette.